Welcome to Cloudy with a Chance of Insights. I'm Richard Hogan, joined today by David Rowley. Cyrus is absent this week, so it is just the two of us. We've got a full episode planned for today. So David has been sitting out for a week or so, and in my experience, that always means he's been quietly accumulating things worth talking about. So I'm going to let him loose on that shortly. From my end, I want to talk about Copilot Credit Pre-Purchase Plan, which is a bit of a mouthful, and the Agent Factory framework that wraps around it. Because this came out back at the end of last year, and it slipped past me completely. I only found out about it yesterday. I've then got a bit of a soapbox segment. So I was listening to a podcast earlier on this week that actually made me a little bit grumpy, and I'll talk about that in a bit. We've got Build coming up next week, and now I'm not going to sit here and predict what's going to happen at Build, but I want to try and frame what the thoughts are coming out of that and how you should probably perceive that. And finally, I'm going to pick up with computer use agents in Copilot Studio, which went GA earlier on in this month. But first, David, you have been, as we alluded to, sitting on a pile of saved items, having missed the last episode there. So I'm not going to try and summarize those. I'm just going to pass it across to you to kick off.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm not sure if we've actually spoken about it. So I thought I'd briefly sort of, I suppose it's a bit oblique, isn't it? But, probably the right place to start. And that's how do you read a week in technology? Well, in my instance, it's kind of two and a bit because I stack stuff up, as you said. So I thought I'd sort of share the way that I do it, and then maybe you can share yours as well, maybe. But it's essentially super simple. So it's all very manual. But every day I'll scan all my usual sources, and then I send myself a little WhatsApp message. And it's not everything, right, because that becomes unmanageable, but it tends to be the things that sort of make me go, well, that's quite interesting, actually. And then by the end of that week, I tend to have a saved list. Now, the thing is that list will often look pretty scattered, right, at first glance. And, and I think, especially in this instance, because some of the things I'm talking about this time are some of the things that I wanted to talk about last time. So then how do you make it work as a cohesive thing, right? So, but there are things that I do use sort of generative AI to help me make sense of the things that I've picked, because I pick them for a reason. And sometimes it's not obvious. And I did a blog post on another thing that I do where I find interesting phrases that sort of resonate, and then tell me what the connections are with those. So I find it really useful in that instance to help me make sense of why I think something's interesting. So that's the way that I do it. I don't know. Do you want to share yours, Richard, or should I just go into my
I think you know how I do mine, because we've talked about this on the weekly work meetings.
Yeah, exactly.
That we have, and I can't remember whether I've discussed it on the pod before.
I think we have.
But I don't know, about 6 weeks ago, perhaps 2 months ago, I came to the same conclusion as you. So I used to have like an RSS feed reader, and it obviously just lists everything that comes out from the sources that you subscribe to. And I was thinking, well, it's good. It's one way of getting the sort of knowledge discovery in there. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell me what's important. And it doesn't tell me whether there's a correlation between Article A and Article E, or whether we've talked about it in the podcast before, or I've done a newsletter on it, or I've blogged about it. So what I did, as I said, you're aware of this, but I don't think other people will be, is I gave that problem to GitHub Copilot. And I now have an app that is basically, I'm calling it sort of my personal knowledge base. But one of the features that it does is it looks at the RSS feeds that I've had set up in, I don't know, whatever feed reader I was using. It runs that through an AI model. and it tries to rank it based on relevance to the criteria that I've set. So is it Azure architecture, for example? Is it like a Microsoft case study, which they tend to do quite frequently and push onto the Azure blogs? Because I'm not necessarily that interested in those. It's good to know that, you know, company X has deployed, you know, this number of Copilot licenses, blah, 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 blah. But there's not usually much architectural impact or in those. So that gets a lower score than, say, a new product release would do, or a Microsoft research paper would do. Then it goes and creates something called Sparks, which is the linkage between relevant topics. Now, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, because Google stole my phrase. They've got now something called Google Spark, which is like, and that draws correlations between different articles, but also blog posts that I might have done, or newsletters, or podcast episodes. So there is now, it doesn't work very well at the moment. I need to work on it. A sort of a graph behind the scenes that is actually mapping all of those. So when a new feed comes, a new item comes into the feed, it basically ranks it based on relevancy in terms of what the article content is, whether I've talked about it before, whether it's relevant to a particular project, for example, and then tries to build up that graph. So in theory, at the moment, I've got, I don't know, about 50 or 60 articles in there, but I really only have to look at the top, I don't know, say 10. And that gives me the important stuff. I can also go and look at the other bits and pieces as well, but that sort of ranks it for me. But anyway, that's how I manage the same process.
It's far more organized than I should probably do something similar.
Well, it's advantages of having sponsored token usage within RPM, whether that's Copilot or whether it's Bob. So it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, cool. All right. Super. So the things I spotted, so there's something about, there's a new Container Apps Express, which is interesting, which is being positioned as I think a developer first, agent first sort of runtime environment. Quite interesting. You've got the latest Microsoft work trend. I saw you blogged on that, so maybe we can have a chat about that. There was something I spotted on the model context protocol. So I remember we spoke about this a little while ago, and I did a little bit on it being a year old, and my God, look how much it's been used in that period. In that period. So there's a little update on there because there's a new release candidate for model context protocol. There was an interesting thing about AI red teaming agent in Microsoft Foundry. That was interesting. And then updates to Windows 365 AVD. And two little things. I like my tools. So discovered a thing called Event Log Expert that actually looks really quite useful if you're into looking at event logs. And I'm going to wrap up with a little ditty about Zoom It, because have you watched the Mark and Scott Does series? And in this one, they Mark was demonstrating so some new cool capabilities in Zoom In. It all went horribly wrong. It was quite nice, and they didn't edit it out, so that's nice. And I guess individually you could just sort of write a summary of each of those, and I could have just spoken about it that way. But to the conversation we were having before, when I put them together and poke at them a little bit, they all sort of start pointing towards the same thing, and that's always more interesting than any individual item in the set, which I think we've discovered is the way I work. So a bit of a realization I had earlier this morning. I was like, I do this all the time, and I don't think I've explicitly been doing it sort of intentionally. It's just something I've been doing. So what I want to do is I'll walk through these, and we'll get a view of the shape. So the first one, the work trend index, and this is always interesting because it frames the human and the organizational side of the discussion, right? And I think it's always the right place to start these conversations. And my take was, the report argues that as AI and agents take on more of the execution, that means human agency can expand further, which is okay. What does that mean? So I guess the framing is that when AI handles more of the doing, people have more room to, I guess, direct the work, make the decisions, own the outcomes. And that is, I guess, that's the optimistic glass half full view, right? The bit I found interesting, I suppose, was sort of the more underlying question, which is, are organizations, and I think we've touched on this already a few times, right? But are they actually ready to actually built to capture that opportunity, or whether they're just absorbing another layer of tooling? And I think we had that very specific conversation before, and without changing any of the fundamentals. And we're still seeing it, right? It still gets discussed as a feature rollout. We deploy Copilot, we connect an agent, we measure the time saved on a task. Those are, I guess, it's a double negative. They're not unimportant measures, but they tell you still, I think, relatively little about whether the organization has actually changed how work is understood, governed, and improved, right? And I think the harder question then is what the report is sort of getting at is where agents should participate in work at all. Some of these processes are mature enough and clear enough, and I guess you could argue valuable enough for an agent to operate in them sensibly. Others are super ambiguous. Well, let's face it, most organizations, there are politically owned boundaries, right? Things are poorly documented, full of, dare I say, sort of logic and execution paths that only experienced people of that organization can navigate well. And in those cases, if you introduce an agent, it's going to be horrific, right? It's going to cause a far, far worse result than the effort to put in to try and create it. So I think for me, the leadership task here has become more specific than it used to be. Just do AI, right? But it's not, that mandate needs to have some finesse to it now. I think it's not just about enabling AI. It's about deciding which work is clear enough and safe enough for this agentic participation, and weirdly, defining what stays as a human decision and building the conditions for people to learn how to direct them, right, as opposed to just consuming them as a product. And I think that's probably a more grounded version of what human agency means in practice. So be interested to know what you think, Richard, because you wrote a blog on this as well. You're on mute. Richard is talking. We can't hear him, pod.
There we go. Now I'm off mute.
Go on then.
So, so you've hit across something that I'm having to work through at the moment. Now, I can't say what I'm working on. I get that a lot these days. It's actually really, really frustrating. It's good because it's showing that IBM is getting much better at working and integrating with Microsoft. But it's very frustrating from my part that I always have to constantly think about what I can say and what I can't say. But that whole agent governance piece is becoming really, really important, especially when you're talking about doing, which IBM is doing actively at the moment, talking about either autonomous agents. And there's a new phrase that I've been getting from a chap here at IBM called deep agents, which is basically another word for sort of fully autonomous agents. And it is as you said about whether what you allow them to do. Where does the human in the loop come into that process? Is it just something you just let loose and go and do whatever it needs to do? And it also does sort of lead me into the second topic that I mentioned that I was going to cover off in the intro. So I'll actually put that in now very briefly,
go for it.
and then not worry about it later on. Which was I was listening to a podcast earlier on this week. I'm not going to say which podcast it was or who the provider was for this podcast. People can probably guess, but it was all about how AI adoption is not a technical change.
Mm.
It's a business and user change. And I don't know about you, David, but that just made me very grumpy, because that was exactly the same language that was being used around M365.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember back in the day, 10 years ago or whatever it was. It was doing M365 in Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. It's not a technology change. It's a business change. It's a user change. So you have to go and do all the adoption activities. And this podcast was introducing this like this was a new concept, and I'm like, no, this is not a new concept. This has been going on for years and years and years. And why are we going back and retreading old ground when we should, especially as consultancies, should already have all this in our back pocket to turn around and say, look, this is an adoption change roadmap for Copilot or for Gemini or Claude or whatever AI agent it is.
Yeah.
Because from a user perspective, it is really about how do you use it? How do you best leverage the functionality that's been given to you? The organization has to worry about the governance and where it should be used and how it should be controlled, etc. But from a user perspective, it is, why should I use it? What's the benefit? And we're seeing this now across the board, that people are being having metrics applied to generative AI use or agentic use, which is, it's one way of measuring it, but really it should be more about, well, actually, here's how you can use it to help yourself. And it's not about whether you agentify yourself out of a job or whatever it might well be. But it does become very much a case of bringing people along on the journey, as opposed to just saying, here's some stuff, you go away and figure out what to do with it yourselves, and we're just going to measure how often you write a query into your agent. But so I'm not going to talk about that now in my section, because I was listening to that podcast and I was just getting increasingly frustrated as it was going along, talking about what metrics they should be looking at and talking about, how you do adoption campaigns. It's like, but this is all stuff that we should all know. Just because we changed a badge from, modern work to AI, it doesn't really change the underlying piece. But anyway, there you go. That was my soapbox moment.
I completely agree. And, the metric, how many times has the product been used? That's an endemic issue. I mean, even, dare I say, even within large organizations such as IBM, there
no comment.
Measuring how much somebody's using a tool isn't a representation of the value that's gained from the tool.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think that there's an important point there, because a lot of those metrics are targeted at driving out bugs, not driving out value for the user. It feels like, and I think you're right. We need a better conversation in that space, for sure. Yeah, I agree. All right, Karen, let me crack on. So the next thing I was going to talk about was the new MCP release candidate and what it actually changes. So this is a bit more technical detail than a bit of waffle. And I think the absolute headline change here is that MCP is now stateless at the protocol layer. And I suppose to appreciate why that matters, it helps us to understand what it's sort of replacing. So in the previous version of the spec, every MCP session started with an initialization handshake. Server issued a session ID, and then every sort of subsequent request had to carry that ID, which meant the client was pinned whichever server instance that had issued it, right? And so if you wanted to run multiple MCP server instances behind a load balancer, had to have sticky sessions and what is it? Shared session store. That's the word. And that's not anything complicated, right? But it's more infrastructure than you possibly want to be throwing at that particular sort of thing. So, and it can then cause friction at the infrastructure layer, and if you're trying to fit something into a production environment that have been built with standard, dare I say, HTTP assumptions. So in the release candidate, that handshake is gone, session ID is gone, and any MCP request is now a self-contained unit that any server instance can handle. So that means you can now just put a plain round robin load balancer in front of MCP server and it works, right? And that's a huge, huge improvement from an architectural perspective. It simplifies things loads. There are a couple of other things that change in and around that area. So the protocol now requires some new headers. They are MCP method and MCP name headers on request, which means that obviously now the load balancers and gateways can route to the operation without having to inspect the body. Again, speeds things up. Tool list responses now carry cache metadata, a TTL, and a cache scope. So now the client knows how long a list of tools is fresh, and whether it's safe to sort of share that across users. What else? We've also got, I forget what the acronym is, the W3C trace, WC3, I can never remember what those, trace context propagation is formally specified. Kind of fixes things like key names and means a distributed trace that starts in your application can follow the tool call all the way through the SDK through to the MCP server and whatever the client calls downstream. So it sort of appears as a single coherent trace in open telemetry. Super. And that is, I think, super significant and kind of can be lost in some of the stuff because, most of us at the more infrastructure layer care about diagnosing what actually happened. So super useful. What else does it include? It includes some extra extensions, a formal extensions framework. So now we've got things like reverse DNS identifiers and version independently version independently of the core specification. Oh, what else? We can also MCP apps let servers provide interactive HTML interfaces, which is interesting. So it renders in the sandbox frame. So and then every UI interaction going through the same audit and consent path. So that's quite interesting. And we can have they've updated tasks, reshaping long-running work around the stateless model, so the server can respond to a tool call with a task handle, and the client drives it with a sort of separate get, update, and cancel calls. And that the important thing there is that the task stage again is explicit and visible to the model rather than sort of hidden in all the transport metadata. There's a bunch of other stuff that I think I'm just going to skip through, and I think the reason I found the release candidate sort of significant, it's not any one of there's a bunch of stuff there, right? It's not one of those in combination. It's the, I think it's signs of a protocol that is trying to graduate from sort of interesting to truly operable in enterprise environments, and it enables that shift, from can I call a tool from something to Can it be governed? You know, all the things we keep talking about, but can it be governed, scaled, evolved safely? And for me, that's the thing that matters for production environments. And I think this, you know, this release is probably a really good step towards that. Cool. Okay, run, shall I? So the next thing was, I'll whiz through it quickly, Azure Container Apps Express. And this is, on its face, I think, something that addresses the runtime question. And I guess I want to be careful because I don't want to I don't want to overstate what it can do, because it's fresh out the doors, right? And somewhat helpfully, the documentation at the moment is quite explicit about what it is and what it's not designed for. And I think that explicitness, you don't always get that, right? It's more, here's a new shiny thing, go use it, it'll save, you know, it'll solve world hunger and do everything for you. But what Microsoft have positioned it, Container Apps Express, as is a fast, opinionated deployment path for containerized web apps. And that is targeted at sort of a developer first, agent first, suited to HTTP first workloads. See the linkage to the MCP thing we were just talking about there, and include, you know, including things like, you know, lightweight APIs, AI gateways, AI app front ends, and agent backends. And you can scale down to 0. And this is what interests me, because, you know, as a, dare I say, hobbyist in many places, I think it could be quite interesting, actually, for some of the stuff that we do, right, Richard, to be able to scale to 0 when we're not doing anything, and then just have it burst up when we want it to do it. Because, you know, typically my usage is fairly intermittent. So I thought that was interesting.
Almost was the promise of cloud computing, wasn't it? But it never really goes down to 0, which would be really nice if it could do.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm really looking forward to experimenting with it and seeing what I can do. It has a really minimal configuration service, back to the opinionated thing. And I think, you know, the you've already guessed, right? I'm sure the people listening have guessed the reason this is relevant to the broader thread that I'm pulling at here is that a lot of agent-facing services are going to start small. When you're building something experimental, you know, whether it's prompt orchestration, whether it's some sort of simple evaluation harness, a lightweight internal tool, we've got a lot of those, right, because we experiment, or whether it's an API that sits in front of the model, you don't want the full platform engineering conversation before you can get it running. And I suppose if every early stage service requires significant, I wrote investment, but I think it's not even investment, it's significant time in getting the thing approved, right? If we think about large organizations, it's not necessarily the money thing, but it's the time, it's the approvals, it's the cycle you have to go through to even justify the thing to exist in a production environment.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in some organizations, the multiple change boards you have to go through and prep to actually do anything within a particular environment. You know, cybersecurity reviews, blah, 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 blah. It can be especially now, you could, in theory, spin up an app in a few days, not necessarily production ready, hasten to add, but then you want to try and progress that through an environment so you can test it in a wider audience. And it takes a huge amount of time longer to do that than it did to actually build the app in the first place. But,
yeah, for sure. And, you know, the net result of that is the learning loop slows down, and then teams stop experimenting, and then you've got, well, back to the conversation, oh, well, why is nobody using the AI, right? Well, that's the reason why you're making it flipping difficult. So, yeah, I think that's a really valuable approach. And what else did I want to call out? So it is just HTTP focused. You're not going to get GPU workloads in there. You're not getting TCP based services, right? Just HTTP. So things like jobs and batch processing are microservices that require, I guess, service discovery. There's a bunch of other stuff. What else is not in there? Dapper integration, not there. Not that I've actually used it. I keep meaning to look at that, but I still haven't looked at it properly. So go have a look at the documentation, because those explicit constraints, as I said at the top, is actually more useful than sort of a vague promise of, isn't this amazing? And I think this illustrates a broader principle that I think applies quite well to agentic systems. And velocity is really valuable when you understand the constraints you're operating under. The dangerous version, I guess, is people just forging ahead, right? It'll be all right. Teams build something on, that they think looks like it'll do the thing, but it doesn't. So it might be worthy of another pod, I suppose, but organizations need multiple paths to production, and those paths are matched to the risk, the maturity of each workload. And obviously Express looks like a sensible thing for the early stages, and then something more capable will be needed as those evolve. So yeah, super interesting.
Absolutely.
How am I doing for time? Okay,
we're all good for time.
We're all good for time. Superb. So the next thing was the AI red teaming agent. We love a bit of security on the pod, don't we? So I thought I'd and this is in Microsoft Foundry, and the description that I guess I've summarized is that it proactively finds safety risks in generative AI systems during design and development. So it uses automated scanning measures, something called the attack success rate, and tracks findings over time. So you can see whether your risk posture is improving or degrading. For agentic systems specifically, the documentation calls out the risks do not really apply to, I guess you could argue, a simpler chatbot model. It's more like prohibited actions, sensitive data leakage, task adherence, and stuff like indirect prompt injection, which is sort of more worth dwelling on, because those are the things that we care about. And can I explain what indirect prompt injection is? People might not know, might they?
Yeah.
So this is where malicious instructions are hidden inside external data sources that the agent retrieves through tool calls. So your agent is following its instructions correctly. It goes and fetches an email or a document or a record or whatever from a database, and embedded inside that retrieved content is a instruction that is designed to redirect what the agent does next. And the agent, being a good agent, that's exactly what it was built to do. It follows the new instruction rather than the user's original intent. And that's a fundamentally different risk profile to having a chatbot, right? Because before it used to be, and there's training, right? And I think somebody shared the training, like you can go in and try and convince the chatbot to do something and try and do this. And, there's lots of examples of where you can get a chat interface to do these things. But when you think about an agent connected to tools, and it takes that poor action, I suppose you could say poor action, but you know what I'm saying, it can reveal information through the tool call. And I think there's been a few examples of this in the news relatively recently, where somebody's managed to extract some data out of an organization by doing these things, and it'll complete the task, right? And it'll almost bypass every single procedural constraint that the organization cares about. And when you're demoing like a capability, so user using a tool to get all these demos are always dare I say, designed for the happy path. I don't think I've ever seen a demo where, okay, well, what happens when it goes wrong? And nobody ever does that, do they, Richard?
That is a good point, and I need to build that into the demo that I'm going to be doing in a couple of weeks' time, because going back a little bit, the governance pieces around this becomes very key. So actually, why don't you demo something that has a an unhappy path element in there to say, look, this is where the governance kicks in. Anyway, never mind. You carry on.
Yeah. So anyway, so then the production question is, what happens when the retrieved content, right, is hostile? What happens when a tool returns partial or corrupted data? What happens when two systems disagree about state? I guess what happens when the user's request appears perfectly reasonable but will conflict with the policy the agent has, I guess, no explicit instruction to honor. So there you go. Think ideas for your demo, right?
Yeah.
And I'll say up front now, and I'll always say this: automated red teaming does not replace human judgment. Again, somewhat helpfully, Microsoft have been fairly explicit around that the results that are provided can have limitations, right? So I think it's the value though is in repeatability. Yeah. So you're trying to get away from that repetitive fatigue of doing the same thing over and over and over. Have you checked this? Have you checked this? Have you checked this? That's where human error creeps in, right? So now teams can test continuously and see whether risk posture is improving or degrading over time, and ultimately, hopefully, start to bring sort of AI safety closer to the rhythm of normal engineering practices. Mm-hmm. And the analogy I guess I would use is regression testing. So agent behavior needs something like regression testing in sprint, even if the tests themselves look quite different from sort of
quite frankly testing. In the prompt I now inject regression testing into each prompt I send to GitHub Copilot.
Yeah, you're always one step ahead. I like this, Richard. And if agents are going to participate in real work, their behavior needs to be checked repeatedly, not just reviewed once at the beginning and then at the end, right? So that's exactly what you just said. So spot on.
You'd be surprised at how many times you put a prompt into, say, GitHub Copilot. I mean, it could be Claude Code, it could be Bob. It doesn't really matter. The behavior is pretty consistent. Is that it will then go and break something that it was previously working. So I literally do have a routine now that I put the prompt in, and that prompt always includes success criteria, rollback paths, regression test controls, and a few other sort of test processes, pretty much for every single prompt that I give it. But anyway, yeah, that's a lesson learned.
Good. I think I'm going to skip the AVD and VDI thing because I'm just looking at the time and I want you to have time to cover your stuff as well, Richard. So I think I'm going to jump to the I am going to jump to my final couple of bits, I think. Yeah, the resilience. No. Yeah, the Zoom It session. So Mark and Scott do what's it called? Mark and Scott.
Is it? I mean, I'm assuming everybody knows, but is it worth just saying that that's Mark Krasanovic and Scott Hanselman?
Yeah, and they do a little Mark and Scott do type thing, and the last one I watched was where Mark was demonstrating some new functionality, and it's really cool, right? So the functionality is Zoom it, we know we can sort of take pictures and do videos and snapshots and all that sort of stuff, and a whole wealth of other capability. And Mark has created a pan mode, so you can do like a scrolling screenshot almost of an area, which is super cool. So, you know, if you've got a web page or something really, really long, I'm off camera, there goes something really long, that you're trying to capture, the tool will do that. And obviously that's relatively complicated to do, but he's been using a lot of generative AI to make the changes to the Zoom It tool. And in the session, he they spin up the demo and the demo's broken. And he like there's this narrative that's going on, which is, you know, Scott going, oh, this is great, you know, and Mark going, oh, you'll just cut this bit out of the video, right, and it'll be fine, and we'll jump to the bit where it works. But they keep it all in, so you kind of see Mark having to, in real time, look at different branches of code, find a branch of code that actually does the thing that works, and then do the demo. So I think it's a really good example of just working through, oh my god, why doesn't it work? Oh, this build has been broken because of the AI has gone off and done something around it. I can't remember what it was, but you found what the problem was, managed to get back to a build that worked. But that, you don't often see that side of things, right, in public. And I think it was really, really nice that they kept it all in, because I think it makes it, we're all at risk of being too polished, right, in terms of what we do, and having that sort of sharing is really, really nice, I think, for a lot of people, because it goes wrong for us a lot of the time, and what you often see is a very small percentage of a final finished polished thing.
And don't worry, you're not going to run the risk of this podcast sounding polished. We will even keep in the I'm on mute bit right at the start of it.
So super interesting. And I think
a slight one on Zoom It, David. I don't know whether you've come across this or whether it was just me being a bit daft again. So I found out the other day when I was doing a demo that if you share just the browser screen, especially if the browser screen is probably not in full screen, perhaps that might be why, but if you just share the browser window in like Teams, Zoom It doesn't work.
No. Yeah.
So I was like, so I had to stop sharing and go into full window mode, and then Zoom It worked for that. But
little plug for my Mirror Me app. That's exactly what I've got, my Mirror Me app. I can do those things.
Yeah, that's frustrating. Anyway, again, slight diversion. Back to you.
A slight digression. Yeah. So let me bring it all together. I think what connects these things together is the thought, a question, I suppose, which is more durable than the usual ability framing, right? And the question is, what, I feel like I'm repeating myself, and it's obviously something that I need to stop doing, but it keeps coming up. And what needs to exist around a model for it to function reliably in an organization? You know, the work trend index frames it really well. The container apps express point to simpler runtime paths. You know, the red teaming agent then make sure that whatever those agents are connecting to is safe, secure, and all that stuff. The AVD stuff was about, okay, well, how can those tools have an environment to do those things in? And then, you know, underneath all that, we still have sort of the stuff that us admins use, things like Event Log Expert, things like Zoom It, when we're trying to sort of, I don't know, the bring it back to the craft of actually building and diagnosing and explaining systems. So it's super interesting, I think.
It is. We are, certainly in IT world, I think we're living through an interesting time at the moment, because this is really changing the way that you have to think about what you do, regardless of what role you're in, whether it's a technical role or whether it's a business role. This is really sort of having to, make you think about how you do things and what the impact of that might well be further down the stream. So yes, worrying but interesting. And we covered the worrying bit before quite a few times on the podcast.
Over to you, Richard.
Yeah. So I will try and keep this brief as well. And so one of the things that came up actually in the conversation yesterday that somehow I'd managed to completely miss was the P3. Microsoft called it a SKU. I'm not actually quite entirely sure whether it is a SKU, but anyway, it stands for pre-purchase plan for Copilot. Actually, the full name is Copilot Credit Pre-Purchase Plan, but that is a bloody mouthful. So P3 is probably a much easier way to call it. Now, I don't know whether it's just me that's missed this or whether other people have it as well, but I suppose it's because it's not really a product announcement that I missed it. It's more about a billing piece as opposed to a sort of a new product announcement, as I said. So I think that probably meant that it slipped under my radar. But the commercial implications are probably significant enough that I probably should have been on there. And it's something that you probably do need to have conversations with whoever it is that you're talking to about some of this ones. But anyway, P3 is basically a 1 year upfront option for purchasing Copilot credits. So you basically buy a pool of credits called CCCUs, and that pool draws down automatically as you consume the credits across Studio, Dynamics, Foundry, a few other models. And then you basically get a discount. So it's like one of those things where you prepay and you get a discount. I think it goes from like about 5% to I think 20%, depending on the amount that you're going to commit to. Now, there's a couple of things that are going on around this as well. And I think there's been a few announcements, and I suspect, I don't know for definite, but I think there might well be an announcement around this in Build coming up next week. But I don't, I'm not sure. That could be wishful thinking from my side. So anyway, these are things that you probably need to be aware of if you are planning to deploy agentic or generative AI workloads across the Microsoft estate. It is tied to your Mac. So for those of you that don't know what a Mac is, and again, if from a technical side, you probably don't, but you might well want to, which stands for Microsoft Azure Consumption Commit or something like that. But basically, it's an agreement between you and Microsoft to say you will spend X amount on Microsoft services, and Microsoft will give you basically X, Y, and Z for whatever that commitment is. So it's baked into that. So usage of this actually goes towards your Mac burn down. It's not clear whether those discounts are on top of what's called ACD, which is Azure Credit Discount, which is basically the discount you get off the Azure commit prices based on your Mac commitment. I don't know whether it's actually included in that, so that's probably another question that is probably worth asking on that one. So that was P3. So I think that's something that, as I said, I completely and utterly missed. But it's probably worth having a look at if you're looking at deploying.
I was going to say, is it? I can't remember what it was called, but there were PTUs. Was it PTUs? And is it a rebranding of the PTU thing?
It might be. I couldn't find anything in the documentation that I was reading about this. Yeah. But as I said, I was like on a call with Microsoft last night. And they were saying, oh, P3 SKU and P3 SKU this and P3 SKU that. And I was going, what on earth are they talking about? I've never heard of a P3 SKU. Yeah. So I had to do some research whilst I was on a call to find out what on earth they were talking about. But yeah, apparently it's just a way of bundling a load of AI services. So not just Copilot. So the name is a little bit confusing from what I found. So it's not just Copilot. It's a load of Foundry stuff, a load of models related to that, a load of Copilot pieces as well. So they are sort of bundling all this consumption up into like a prepaid package to give you a bigger discount on that. But obviously you're committing to spending a certain amount. And I think, if I remember correctly, there's no rebates or refunds if you don't hit that amount. And I can't remember exactly what happens if you exceed that amount. If you exceed it, it probably goes back to some sort of standard pieces, but worth double checking.
Yeah. So the PTUs was provision throughput is a deployment type in Foundry that provides dedicated model processing throughput for your environment. So I think it a flavor of what you just said. So if what you've highlighted covers Foundry as well, it does sound like there's a bit of a shift.
Yeah. And I think that where this might be going is there's also something called Microsoft Agent Factory, which the acronym is really annoying. So that's basically math, yes, which is also Microsoft Agent Framework. So I know there's probably only a limited number of acronyms around in the world, but please, can we have some other names? Which, as I understand it, Microsoft Agent Factory is basically a grouping together of all of these things, including like FDE support. And we all know now FDE is the latest buzzword that was in the industry. So forward deployed engineers to help you better leverage that. So again, worth having a look and a dig into that, especially if you are primarily Microsoft shop and looking to deploy some of these across. Now, I've already covered the podcast section, so I'm not going to go back and regurgitate or replay that one. The last thing that I was going to cover off in this section was computer use. So basically, Microsoft announced that Copilot Studio is going to be have the ability to do this I think it was in preview in May, but it might have actually been GA. I'm just trying to find my notes to define that. But I think it's interesting that Microsoft is probably a little bit late onto this one because computer use was sort of, I suppose it was coming out with things like the Rabbit R1, like 2 years ago. But in effect, for those that aren't on board with the term, this is basically when you get your agent to, in effect, control your browser in the way that you do. So in effect, it will take control of your cursor and start clicking around your browser screen. Now, critically, I think on this one, it doesn't need an API or connector. So it basically just bakes into the operating system in Assume. Now, there is a lot of things that I think you need to consider for this, especially for sort of legacy systems with no integration surface, for example. But one of the things that I remember from back in my M365 days is a lot of people used to hook into the M365 user interface, but without necessarily integrating properly. So they'd be looking for specific commands or tags within the HTML. I've got a horrible feeling this is going to be one of those things that everybody was going to obviously refreshes their user interface in the web quite frequently. So you're going to have a computer use agent is probably going to do, I don't know, it might well be book you an Uber or whatever. I think that's one of the favorite examples, isn't it? And then Uber changes the user interface, and then the agent goes, oh my God, I can't find what I'm doing. So that might be one thing. But as I said, Microsoft is not the only one who have looking at this. Google I/O was last week as we're recording this, I think. And they made a lot of announcements around what they're going to be doing with Gemini, which covered a lot of computer use components as well. Anthropic in their event a couple of weeks ago also did something around sort of agent sort of autonomous agent builders in their interface as well. So you just spin up an agent and get it to do whatever it wants to, or whatever you want it to do in that element as well. So all of these organizations are starting to look at how they're sort of using some of these things going forward. But there's obviously, well, at least I say obviously, perhaps it's not obvious, but from my perspective, there are a couple of risks here. One is that obviously if you've given an agent autonomy to go and mess around with a website or with an application, in theory, that could go and do anything within that application that it's got permissions to do. So you do obviously have to be very, very careful about what it can and cannot do. And, some things might be fairly innocuous. It might go and order you some, I don't know, something cheap from Amazon, or it might go and do something even more ridiculous on Amazon. And speaking of which, apparently, and I do need to dig into this a little bit more, but Amazon are actually suing Perplexity at the moment.
Oh, really?
Around the ability for Perplexity browser to go into Amazon's marketplace, in effect, and buy things. Because obviously Amazon don't really want automated purchasing going on, because I think it probably loses some of their, oh, you've bought this, why don't you buy this as well? Or people buy this and this together. So the Amazon will lose out on some of that. And I suppose that the bot might well not pick the Amazon choice brands or whatever it is that Amazon is trying to push you towards. So anyway, I think there is an ongoing court case around that at the moment.
Interesting.
Another consideration for that. Oh, God, I suppose if we talk about court cases, we could be here all day with AI. There's still the New York Times one going on I'm aware of, and that there's loads others around that, even in Europe as well.
Yeah. But it's super interesting, isn't it? Because the premise that here's a website that we want you to use, but you're not using it the way we want you to use it, so we're going to sue you. It's a super interesting conversation, that, right? I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, and it is, and again, for sort of architects, we sort of have to think about different things when we're looking at this as well. So, I mean, reliability, how consistent can that agent be at doing whatever it is that you're asking it to do within a browser or a VM? Because in theory, I suppose you could spin up a VM with an app on it, get the agent to do something in that VM, and then shut the VM down. But if you're doing that, how do you control what's going on? How the agent is working? What happens when the agent does something weird? What happens if the interface doesn't work or it crashes? So that we have to sort of be cognizant of those types of pieces. Governance comes into play, and we've talked about governance a lot today, so I'm not going to drill into that. And then you've got the whole sort of legal pieces that I brought up with the Perplexity and Amazon side. So
super interesting.
Yeah, it's I think that is a minefield, and that's going to be another one that's going to be interesting to look for. And then finally, and again, I'm not going to belabor this point now, we've got Build coming up next week. Now we've got a couple of my colleagues, or a couple of our colleagues, are attending. I'm not. There is a concern over travel at the moment, so a lot of those types of things are sort of frowned upon at the moment within organisations. So we'll just have to see what comes out of that. But I am expecting a lot more announcements around adoption, governance, security, and probably more sort of deeper agentic type workflows and activities. With all the sort of focus being around how do we get better adoption across the Microsoft stack, not just Copilot, but Foundry, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what we have to sort of have in the back of our minds.
Agree.
Yeah. Anyway, I know I sort of sped through those topics a little bit, but we are pretty much on time, I think. Just checking the clock. So unless there's anything else from you, David.
No, I think we need to move away from governance, because I'm guilty of feeling a bit repetitive now. So any interesting topics that folk want us to talk about, then hit us up. I'm sure we can bring them in.
Today has been a very governance heavy heavy session. But it is, to be fair, it is an important topic, and it's something that is playing catch up to everything else. It's what it is. Anyway, so which I think just leaves me to say thank you everybody for joining us this week and for this episode. As always, you can follow us, subscribe, whatever the mechanism is from the platform that you're consuming this episode from. Please do drop us a comment if you've got any questions, or if you've seen an interesting way of doing governance, for example, against AI agents. Please do let us know. Otherwise, it just leaves for me to say, again, thank you very much. And we will see you in 2 weeks' time.